Hey guys, welcome to the channel. My name's Jen and today I'm going to talk you through the basics of vermicomposting. I'll talk you through what it is, some common methods people use to do vermicomposting, and surprisingly why it's not the only composting method you need in your garden. Let's get into it. Vermicomposting is the act of using worms to break down food scraps to create compost. It's usually done in some sort of enclosed bin where you'll have browns and then you'll have food scraps, and the worms will break down those food scraps. Once they're finished digesting those food scraps, they'll excrete what's called worm castings. Worm castings are fantastic fertilizer for your plants, whether they're vegetables or flowers, and you can also create a compost tea with the worm castings. The worm compost tea is actually a very mild fertilizer, which would be fantastic for watering seedlings. Throughout this video, I'll mention some pros and cons of vermicomposting versus hot composting. But one of the best pros of this method is the speed in which it takes to create compost. A traditional hot compost pile will typically take about 6 to 9 months to create that compost, but these worms can speed up the process and give you fertilizer in about 3 months. Vermicomposting in particular might have a little bit steeper of a learning curve than traditional composting. There's a lot of things you can do wrong with vermicomposting. For example, you can overfeed them, you can have the temperature too hot or too cold in the worm bin, and your worms can flee the bin or they can die. So if you're interested in getting into vermicomposting, I recommend you go in with the mindset that you're going to be learning as you go and you may not get it right the first try. Let's talk about a few different methods that people use to do vermicomposting. The first one I'm going to talk through is a large storage bin. The second one is stacked trays or stacked storage bins. The third one is in-bed vermicomposting. And the fourth is going to be a flow-through system. Let's talk through each of these methods in a little bit more detail and I'll show you some examples. The first method is using a large storage bin. In this method, what people will do is put a layer of soil and then a layer of bedding material. Don't worry, I'll talk about what bedding material is in a few minutes. And then food scraps, and then they'll put the worms on top. The way that it works is the worms will eat those food scraps, and then over time they'll excrete earthworm casting, and eventually the whole bottom layer of that bin will be earthworm castings. And then they'll have to separate out those earthworm castings from the bottom, and that's what they can use to amend their soil in their raised bed or make compost tea. Now there's different techniques I've seen to make it a little bit easier to get the earthworm castings out of this large storage bin. One of them involves, over the course of a couple weeks, feeding only on one side of the bin so that you can reserve earthworm castings on one side. That way, when it comes time to harvest, you have worms and food scraps on one side and earthworm castings on the other side of the bin. The bedding material is typically going to be your browns in a compost situation. So it's going to be something like shredded cardboard, coco coir, dried leaves, things like that. And although it's called bedding for the worms, they also consume that material and break it down. One of the most common mistakes that people make in any vermicompost setup is messing up the ratio of browns and greens. A good rule of thumb to start is 3 handfuls of browns to 1 handful of food scraps. The second type of vermicompost setup is actually stacked trays or stacked bins. It's typically 3 layers high and it's completely closed. So this is actually interesting because this is something that you could do indoors if you wanted to. The very bottom layer of those 3 stacked trays is going to be what collects your compost tea, or your, it's called the leachate. It's the liquids that might be produced during this process. This second layer is where you're going to put the bedding, the food scraps, and the worms. Over time, the worms will break down those food scraps, and eventually you'll get to a point where the entire second tray is full of castings. Once you reach that point, the worms are eager to get out of that area. They've already broken down all the food and there's no more nutrients and they're searching for more food. So what you're going to do at that point is begin to put your food scraps in the top third layer. There's also holes between each of these layers of the stacked trays so the worms can move up and down. So the way that it works is once your worms have broken down everything in that second layer and you've begun to put bedding and food scraps in the top layer, that's when the worms will actually migrate from the second layer to the top layer. And that's when it becomes really easy to harvest the earthworm castings out of the second layer. You're going to disassemble the entire stacked tray, You'll take that second layer, and that's your black gold that you can use to amend your raised beds, amend your in-ground soil, or create compost tea. To me, the primary positive about this stacked tray system is how easy it is to harvest the castings. Now there's different products on the market you could buy for this, but you can also do a DIY stack tray system with those same storage containers from option number 1. All you would have to do is add an additional storage bin on top and drill holes in the bottom of that storage bin so the worms can move between layers. The third common method of doing vermicomposting is an in-bed system. This is the method that I'm actually using in my garden right now. Similar to the first method, this is an enclosed bin where you would layer your soil, your bedding, and your food scraps and then add your worms. The part where this method differs is this entire bin has holes all throughout it on the bottom for drainage and also on the sides for the worms to move in and out of that container. So theoretically, the worms will be moving in and out of your bin of food scraps. As the worms move throughout the soil in your raised bed, there's two positive things happening. One of them, they're tunneling through the soil and actually aerating the soil. The second thing they're doing is pooping. So their worm castings are naturally being spread throughout the raised bed. Now there are some limitations to this. The worms don't really move that much. They move maybe a couple feet on either side of the bin. This is why sometimes you'll see a really large raised bed with more than one of these in-bed compost systems. So those are two positive aspects of this particular method, but the negatives include other bugs can get into that bin pretty easily. This is not a closed system like some of the other ones. So you're probably going to get some roaches, and you're also going to get some other bugs in there. I've heard diatomaceous earth can be added to those bins if roaches become a problem, and diatomaceous earth will kill the roaches without hurting the earthworms. Another negative that I just experienced in this video right here where I just harvested out of my in-bed vermicompost bin is this thing is actually pretty hard to harvest out of. Now, I suppose you could remove the entire bin out of the raised bed, shake it out, and try to separate your food scraps and your bedding that need more time and your earthworm castings and your vermicompost. But what I did the other day is actually just use a glove and a shovel to empty out the bin while it stayed in the bed and then separate the two. To be honest, this process probably took longer than anybody wants to spend doing that. But in hindsight, there are some different ways you could mitigate that issue. For example, if you had a raised bed with two of those bins, you could stop feeding in this bin, let it finish breaking down while the worms move over to this bin, and let this bin be the one where you're putting your fresh food scraps and fresh bedding. When it comes time to harvest, you wouldn't have to separate because theoretically this entire bin would be full of vermicompost and you wouldn't have to do any separating. Another positive about the in-bed system is it can help you regulate the temperature a little bit better. Since this in-bed vermicompost bin is entirely surrounded by soil, the soil is going to insulate that bin from extreme temperatures, whether hot or cold. These in-bed vermicompost bins have holes on the bottom as well, and so that leachate, that compost tea that's created every time you water your garden, is actually just draining right back into your bed. Now let's talk about the fourth method people use. The fourth method people use is a flow-through system. In a flow-through system, you're going to be continuously stacking. So imagine starting with a little bit of soil, some food scraps, bedding, and worms. And then once the worms are breaking down those food scraps, you feed them again and you add the appropriate amount of bedding on top. Repeat with food scraps and bedding, food scraps and bedding. And over time, the worms will move up into the system to break down the fresh food scraps while the worm castings remain at the bottom of this system. Now there's different ones on the market. I've seen one from Hungry Bin where you can actually separate the top and bottom portion of that flow-through system to harvest your earthworm castings. I've also seen some DIY flow-through systems that are basically a crate with a mesh in the middle. And the way that that works is the mesh is just fine enough to allow the earthworm castings to drop down into the bottom layer while keeping the fresh bedding and food scraps and worms up top. Then you can harvest from below. The downside of one of these methods is it's usually a little bit messier than something like the clean stackable trays, but it's a very similar concept. Now that we've talked through the 4 different methods that people do vermicomposting, let's talk about the worms themselves. The most common worm I see used for vermicomposting is a red wiggler worm. Now you may be wondering where you're supposed to get them or how much they cost and how many to use. So this is 100 to 120 red wiggler worms. I picked it up at my local nursery. It ended up costing quite a bit actually. It was $22 for this. Now you can also choose to buy Uncle Jim's red wiggler worms. They're on Amazon. I see 500 worms cost about $40. Now you may be wondering, since I bought 100 to 120 worms and you can buy on Amazon 500 worms, how many worms are you supposed to use for your system? There's no exact answer, but what they recommend is 1/2 to 1.5 pounds of worms per square foot of bin space. Red wiggler worms are the most common because number one, they reproduce really rapidly, and number two, they are fantastic at breaking down the food scraps. But if you're also interested in aerating your soil and using something like an in-bed system, you're probably going to want to use some European night crawlers too. Yes, you can mix both types of worms. If you're mixing both types of worms, you're probably going to want to use primarily red wigglers. So I would say probably a 3-to-1 ratio of red wigglers to European night crawlers. European night crawlers are superior for soil aeration. So now we know about the 4 popular methods of doing vermicomposting, and we know what worms we need to use for vermicomposting. So why did I say at the very beginning of this video that that's not the only composting solution that you need in your garden? Well, my reason for saying that comes from the perspective of trying to make use of all of your food scraps. Worms are kind of picky about what they eat. That means it's going to be really hard to succeed if you're filling your bin with citrus peels, hot peppers, onions, garlic. I don't know about you guys, but those are some of the top foods I use in my house when I'm cooking. Almost every recipe I do starts with some sort of oil, onion, and garlic. So unless I have another method of composting my food scraps, I'm still just putting those things in my trash can. So in my opinion, vermicomposting is a fantastic composting solution, but it's not the only one you need. To me, I'm going to be adding a traditional composting method somewhere in my garden as soon as I can figure out how to hide it from my HOA. But another thing you could also consider is one of those electric composters like the Lomi or the Vigo food composter, or Vitamix has one. There's several different options for that on Amazon as well. But that would give you an option to make use with those food scraps. So I hope this video was a good overview explaining what vermicomposting is, how you could get started with it, but why you might want some traditional composting too. This video is going to be the first in a playlist of videos about vermicomposting. Next up, I'm going to be making a video about a DIY in-bed vermicompost system. So stay tuned, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys next time.